In 1917, the area of Flanders to the east of Ypres was of great strategic importance. For the Allies, it was the gateway to breaking out of the stalemate in the north and retaking Belgium. For the Germans, on the high ground, it was a dagger at the Allies' throat. If the British could only break out of the Ypres salient and take it, they could turn north and drive the Germans from the Belgian coast and capture the ports of Ostend and Zeebrugge from the enemy. Also, the German position in Belgium would be outflanked, and their industrial heartland in the Ruhr would be under threat. In addition, U-boats were operating out of Zeebrugge with great success, and the Admiralty was increasingly gloomy about what would happen in the English Channel if the Belgian ports were not closed to the enemy. An attack in Flanders would also hold down the German reserves and relieve the pressure on the French, who needed time to recover from the bloody shambles of Verdun. Field Marshal Haig was under pressure to make an attack in Flanders no matter the cost. The plan that he came up with was to strike out of Ypres to the north and east, and, in conjunction with a seaborne landing on the coast of Belgium at Niepoort, he would capture the high ground at Passchendaele, which was the key to the whole area. The Germans were well aware of the strategic importance of Flanders. That is why Ypres was the most heavily fortified part of their line.
The French and the English now have to kick the Germans out of the French and Belgian territory. That forces them to be on the defensive. If you've seen our site, you've noticed that a little bit more intricate on the German side. We're trying to recreate the Hindenburg line. So you can see the concrete bunkers and the structures. If you look on the Allied side, they're a little bit more cruder because the philosophy of the generals on the Allied side was cannot allow the men to get comfortable in their trenches because then they won't want to attack. So they didn't put the effort into it that the Germans did. And it turned out the Germans were absolute masters at devising defensive positions.
British security was very poor, and the Germans knew all about the forthcoming battle, and had therefore taken countermeasures well in advance. 4 days before the battle was due to begin, the Germans carried out a tactical retreat from their front line back to the more secure Passchendaele Ridge. This left a zone of marshland in the low-lying ground between their new front line and the British. This new position, the Hindenburg Line, was a defense 3 lines deep, the third being beyond the range of the British guns. Between these lines was barbed wire, scattered concrete pillboxes, and machine gun nests.
The Germans made heavy use of concrete. When they fell back to build the Hindenburg Line, they already knew that wooden timbers and dirt and sandbags was not enough because of the heavy caliber artillery they were using. So the Germans, because they had pulled back far enough, built and used concrete. This machine gun bunker is set here to guard this intersection.
The barbed wire funneled the attackers into killing zones, swept by machine guns, and carefully registered by the artillery, so that the attackers could be annihilated by a crippling concentration of shells.
There are 3 ways through here. If the troops in the front trench are pushed back, this is where they fall back to rally. And with the machine gun, that poses a problem for the Allies attacking. If they just come straight down the trench, they're all going to die. Now we're firing blanks, they're playing the game, but it's impossible to come down that trench. As the first 3 or 4 men go down, the next couple go down, eventually the men behind them can't climb over the bodies.
Another German advantage was artillery. The German guns were superior to those of the British. They had a longer range and were more accurate. And most important, the Germans had better shells that were more likely to explode. They also had a new secret weapon, mustard gas, delivered by shell fire. This was a liquid that caused blistering of the skin if touched, if the unfortunate soldier even walked through the zone of evaporation, and the effect on the eyes was disastrous. If inhaled, it could cause pulmonary edema. No antidote was to be found, and after its first use in a barrage on July 26th, 1 man in 6 of the Fifth Army became a casualty. Considered uncivilized prior to World War I, the development and use of poison gas was necessitated by the requirement of wartime armies to find new ways of overcoming the stalemate of unexpected trench warfare. Although it's popularly believed that the German army was the first to use gas, it was in fact initially deployed by the French. Nevertheless, the German army was the first to use it on a large scale. The debut of the first poison gas, however, in this instance chlorine, came on April 22, 1915, at the start of the Second Battle of Ypres. At this stage of the war, the famed Ypres salient, held by the British, Canadians, and French, ran for some 10 miles and bulged into German-occupied territory for 5 miles. A combination of French territorials and Algerian troops held the line to the left, with the British and Canadians tending the center and the line to their right. During the morning of April 22nd, the Germans poured a heavy bombardment around Ypres, but the line fell silent as the afternoon grew. Towards evening, at around 5 p.m., the bombardment began afresh, except that sentries posted among the French and Algerian troops noticed a curious yellow-green cloud drifting slowly towards their line. Puzzled but suspicious, the French suspected that the cloud masked an advance by German infantry and ordered their men to stand to, that is, to mount the trench fire step in readiness for probable attack. The effects of the chlorine gas were severe. Within seconds of inhaling its vapor, it destroyed the victim's respiratory organs, bringing on choking attacks. Panic-stricken, the French and Algerian troops fled in disorder, creating a 4-mile gap in the Allied line. The Germans next turned it on the British and Canadian divisions.
At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there was a very heavy bombardment started, and a little later on, we saw the effects of this. The first thing was hundreds of French troops running away. They were just like ants. They weren't sticking to roads or paths or anything else. They were all over the fields and breaking through hedges and everything. No arms, they'd all gone. And clutching their throats and saying, "Gas, gas."
Without protection from the toxic gas, like their allies, the United Kingdom troops, those who did not die, broke and ran.
We tried to rally them as they got level with us, and they wouldn't stay, and all we got from them was "Alley man, bomb, my lad, my lad." And they kept going, and we got orders to turn around and shoot them, which we did, run away from us. And momentarily we looked, and here we saw this green cloud coming along the ground.
Had the Germans been prepared for this eventuality, they could have potentially have effected a decisive breakthrough. However, the results of their experiment caused as much surprise to the German High Command as confusion among their opponents. German infantry did advance into the gap, but nervously, and with hesitance, outflanking the Canadian and British troops to their right. The ensuing fighting was difficult. Although the Germans succeeded in seizing control of a significant portion of the salient, the Allies nevertheless managed to reform a continuous line, though in parts it remained dangerously weak. When a second gas attack came at Saint-Julien on April 24th, the Canadians, using towels, bandages, and handkerchiefs soaked in urine or water as improvised respirators, courageously prevented further erosion of the front.
One chap had his hand blown off and his wrist was fumbling round, tearing at his throat.
The effect of this gas was to form a sort of foamy liquid in one's lungs and more or less in time drown one, if you were unlucky. Because a lot of the men died pretty quickly. Others were soon down, dying. They were in fact drowning from this beastly foam coming up from their lungs.
And a course of treatment for those gassed was unknown.
From what I have read and have seen, there was like mustard patches that they would put on their eyes. A lot, from what I understand, wasn't, it was a trial and error. This was something new. No one had ever encountered it.
There must have been 200 or 300 men, and they were wriggling and wreathing in all positions, tearing at their throats, their faces black. And an RAMC sergeant, he stood by there, and he looked, well, I'd never seen a man look so despondent. He says, "Look at the poor bastards," he said, "we can't do anything for them."
This was now a war of chemicals and engineering. The Germans' use of chlorine gas provoked immediate widespread condemnation and certainly damaged German relations with the neutral powers, including the U.S. The gas attacks were rapidly put to propaganda use by the British, although they planned to respond in kind on the battlefield. The attack had one clear benefit at home, however, for it brought to an end German hesitancy and internal disagreement over its use. The cat was out of the bag, and the use of poison gas continued to escalate for the remainder of the war. For the British Expeditionary Force, July 1st, 1916 was undeniably the low point of the entire war. There were many more mistakes, costly setbacks, and crises to come. But from that day, the BEF forces on the Western Front showed clear signs of a genuine learning curve. But in high summer of 1916, however, operations on the Somme seemed to offer the frontline troops nothing but unending sacrifice. With the slogging match at Verdun already in its 5th month, there could be no question of halting the Somme offensive. There were no longer any thoughts of a British breakthrough. It was now a wearing-out battle, laying down the foundations for a new decisive attack, possibly in mid-September. In June 1915, a British Army officer, Colonel Ernest Swinton, and the Secretary of the Committee for Imperial Defense, Maurice Hankey, enthusiastically worked to convince the British War Department of the enormous potential of a gasoline-powered armored war machine capable of breaking through German defenses on the Western Front. While Hankey produced the first official memo concerning the tank on December 26, 1914, it was Swinton who organized a demonstration of a vehicle built by Killen Strait to senior politicians in June 1915. In attendance at the demonstration of the Killen Strait tractor were 2 future British Prime Ministers, David Lloyd George and the current First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. Both Churchill and Lloyd George came away impressed by its potential. It was Churchill who, on Colonel Swinton's urging and backed by Hankey, sponsored the establishment of the Land Ships Committee to investigate the potential of constructing what amounted to a new military weapon. The name of the committee was derived from the fact that, at least initially, the tank was seen as an extension of seagoing warships, hence a land ship. The first land ships were produced in secrecy. Its code name, given because the shape of the shell resembled water carriers, was Tank. The name, assigned in December 1915, stuck. Swinton laid down certain key criteria that he argued must be part of the finished design. The tank must boast a minimum speed of 4 miles an hour, be able to climb a 5-foot-high obstacle, successfully span a 5-foot trench, and, critically, be immune to the effects of small arms fire. Furthermore, it should possess 2 machine guns, have a range of 20 miles, and be maintained by a crew of 10 men. The first combat tank was ready by January 1916 and was demonstrated to a high-powered audience. Convinced, Lloyd George, the Minister of Munitions, ordered production of the heavy Mark I model to begin. The lighter, renowned Whippets entered service the following year. The next great offensive on the Somme would be the Battle of Flanders, which began on September 15, 1916. This was the battle intended to reap the rewards from all the hard fighting that preceded it. This was a battle the scale of which would have been unthinkable for the BEF just a year before. It also marked a significant step forward in the British tactical approach to the offensive with the first use of the tank. 36 tanks led the way in an attack at Flanders. Although the attack was itself successful, due in part to the fact that the sudden appearance of the new weapon stunned the Germans, these early tanks proved notoriously unreliable. This was partly because the British, under Commander-in-Chief Sir Douglas Haig, deployed them before they were truly battle-ready in an attempt to break the trench stalemate. They frequently broke down and became stuck in a muddy trench more often than anticipated. Conditions for the tank crews were also far from ideal. The heat generated inside the tank was tremendous, and fumes often nearly choked the men inside. Nevertheless, the first tank operators proved their mettle by operating under what amounted to appalling conditions. On November 20th at Cambrai, the British concentrated 474 tanks, so that for the first time they were deployed for a mass attack rather than scattered in small groups along the front for local infantry support.
But anyway, one day we were in the wagon line, quite a few hours, and somebody came along and said, "Oh, the war's finished." Oh, well, just go down about half a mile down the road and look in the field there, you'll see. Won't tell us why. Anyway, we went down, and quite a crowd there, and there are tanks.
The assault at Cambrai evolved from a tank corps plan for a large-scale raid, the chief object of which was not to seize ground, but to deal the Germans a bruising blow on terrain which, unlike the Ypres salient, actually suited tanks. The Third Army staff expanded the scheme between August and November, transforming it into a major operation against the Hindenburg Line. Both Haig and General Byng perceived advantages in a plan which might not only rebuild the BEF's reputation and revive morale, but also simultaneously draw the enemy's gaze from the Italian front, where the Italians had suffered a near catastrophic defeat at Caporetto on October 24th. Third Army hoped to pierce the Hindenburg system between the Canal du Nord and the Canal Les Escaules before sending cavalry through the breach to secure crossing over the Seine Sea and isolate Cambrai. The main drawback was that the attrition at Ypres and the demands of the Italian front left the BEF with scanty reserves for any exploitation at Cambrai. In short, the plan had outgrown the resources which the BEF possessed in late 1917. Nor was it helped by Byng's desire to employ all the available tanks and infantry divisions in the breakthrough phase. On the positive side, the plan combined some promising tactical elements. These included the decision to abandon the customary long artillery preparation and to permit 1,003 supporting guns to deliver a surprise hurricane bombardment, capitalizing on the new technique of predicted shooting without prior registration of targets. Another novel aspect was the drill for tank infantry cooperation developed by the Tank Corps and endorsed by Byng. 378 fighting tanks, all carrying large brushwood bundles or fascines to assist them crossing trenches, would operate in groups of 3. In each group, an advance guard tank would move 100 yards ahead of 2 main body tanks, its task to subdue German fire and protect the 2 following tanks. The latter would lead infantry sections through the German wires and over the opposing trenches. 98 supporting tanks carried supplies, bridging material, telephone cables, and grapnels for hauling aside barbed wire. Moreover, the British, profiting from the lessons of 3rd Ypres, made greater use of low-flying aircraft to strike German artillery and troops. The opening assault by 6 infantry divisions was made along a 6-mile sector at 6:20 a.m. on November 20th, 1917. The surprise achieved by the sudden bombardment and the employment of massed tanks enabled Byng's formations, in most places, to break through the Hindenburg front and support systems to a depth of 3 miles. However, in the center, the 51st Highland Division failed to take the key village of Flesquières on the first day. Many of its accompanying tanks either broke down short of the objectives or were disabled by German gunners who had created specially trained anti-tank squads. By November 23rd, only 92 tanks remained operational, and because the British cavalry were unable to exploit the initial breach, the old problem of maintaining the impetus of an advance beyond the assault phase again appeared to defy solution. Over the next few days, the Third Army was involved in what was essentially a fierce infantry battle for Bourlon Ridge, west of Cambrai. For all their efforts, the British divisions never completely secured the ridge or neighboring village. They were left with holding a salient 3 miles wide and 4 miles deep. In a surprisingly successful start to the battle, 12 miles of the German front was breached, with the capture of 10,000 German prisoners, 123 guns, and 281 machine guns. Unfortunately for the British, this enormous initial success was effectively canceled out in German counterattacks because the British did not possess sufficient infantry troops to exploit the breach they had created. But the most significant aspect of the battle was that both sides achieved a measure of success, with tactical methods which at last seemed to offer a way out of the long-standing deadlock. The appalling conditions that the average soldier experienced during the First World War are almost impossible for 21st century society to appreciate. Mud, filth, lice, death, disease, and macabre landscapes were the grotesque realities of the front line, making everyday life at times simply unbearable. On top of this, massed infantry attacks, trench raids, and incessant artillery barrages, what the German officer Ernst Junger referred to as drum fire, strained the nerves of men to the breaking point, as soldiers waged a daily battle against the industrially produced material of modern warfare.
Now, because of the types of weapons and the tactics, the trench warfare and whatnot that you had here, you were going to suffer casualties no matter what. And so you did have meat grinders of battles that, even though they were more effective with the men that they had, it still presented high losses of casualties. There was no way to avoid that, I don't believe.
I think, there's probably all soldiers who served on the Western Front, infantrymen, probably had the same basic experience, having to deal with filth and rot and artillery and gas and rats, and I think everybody had that in common.
The idea of moral courage lends an insight into how it was possible to endure the muddy hell of the front lines. But nevertheless, there was a limit to what men could endure, and for the French, when the communal reservoir of moral courage ran dry, the outcome would be a tidal wave of overt discontent. The British Army was quick to realize that if men were kept in the front lines for too long, they rapidly became ineffective, and accordingly, their men were regularly rotated in and out of the trenches. But it was not the same in the French army, where in general, conditions were worse than they were for the British. In 1917, after 3 years of total war, something snapped amongst the poilus, stationed on the Chemin des Dames sector of the Western Front.
The thing that's really different about the French soldier, though, is that he was fighting on his soil. He didn't want to get comfortable. The Germans were building all these incredible defensive structures. The British were really, really building incredible trenches for comfort, for hygiene. The French really did not believe so much in that until later on. The idea being, why should we be so comfortable if the enemy's still on our ground? So if you were to compare your common French trench, it would look like a shambles compared to your average German trench. But as far as his experience in the trenches, probably be very similar to most other soldiers.
The weather that April was particularly inclement, with rain and snow turning the battlefield into the typical quagmire of mud, men, and materiel so often associated with the war. These conditions further meant that only a fraction of the German artillery batteries had been identified before the whistles blew. As a result, the storm of steel into which the French advanced proved to be almost as costly as July 1st, 1916 had been to the British. The Germans knew exactly what was coming, and they had prepared for the onslaught by retiring from their forward positions, lessening the effect of the French bombardment. The 5 million shells that plowed into their lines ultimately did more damage to the French than the Germans, churning the ground into a seething mass of mud and slime. When the infantry went over the top, their rolling barrage proved woefully inadequate, falling desperately short and immolating much of the advancing French forces before they even breached the enemy's lines. As the attack commenced, the Germans appeared from their deep sanctuaries, dazed but relatively unscathed, and began to strafe the French from the rear. It's estimated that the Germans had 100 machine guns for every kilometer of the battlefield. The French didn't stand a chance. At the end of that first day, the French had suffered over 40,000 casualties, but despite what had now become a forlorn hope, the attacks continued over the coming days. In a Herculean effort, the 69th Battalion of the Senegalese Infantry managed to reach the Hurtubise farm on the top of the Chemin des Dames ridge before it was finally annihilated, almost to a man. It was an intolerable defeat for an army that had registered few victories during the war. Robert Nivelle, Commander-in-Chief of the French Army, lost his command on May 15th, and the French were left in a state of abject despair. The famous Elan spirit of the poilu had been broken, battered, and left to die on the slopes of the Chemin des Dames.
These were men who had already been through the meat grinder of Verdun. They had already gone through the meat grinder of the Somme because many French divisions were sent there as well. They had the catastrophic casualties in 1914, as I mentioned, where they lost 350,000 killed in the first 3 months. So they had lost about 1.5 million men dead up to the point of the Chemin des Dames offensive in April of 1917. They had been promised a lot with this offensive, just as they've been promised a lot with all the offensives previously. This one once again ended in disaster. They were promised to go 5 miles in the first day. They went 500 meters at the loss of 20,000 men.
Finally, after countless battles, the reservoir of moral courage had run dry, and on May 5th, the 21st Division mutinied.
The mutiny, or as it sometimes is also referred, collective and discipline action. And the reason why it's important to use, I think, a nuanced term is that it's not a mutiny as we traditionally conceive of it, when the men rise up against their officers, usually with force, violence, and put them down.
Of course, depending on the campaign, obviously the notorious Nivelle offensives of April 1917, the angst came out. They just could not deal with it anymore. They felt like they were really being sent into the slaughter all the time and totally lost faith. So, you saw the same thing happen in the Russian troops who were serving in the French army. Of course, they were affected by their own revolution, so they had problems. But I guess that's a big thing that sets the French soldiers apart, is that once they'd been sent into the slaughter too many times, they said something about it. People like to use the term mutiny. That's wrong. Mutiny means you attack your officers, you stop doing your job. Most of the French soldiers who stopped, it was collective and discipline. They weren't going to leave the front. They just weren't going to attack.
It wasn't just the slaughter on the field of battle that had broken the French. It was the daily grind, the attritional nature of an industrial war, and the feeling of being simply expendable in the eyes of the officers that led them, that had finally caused the dam to burst.
This is once again, it became a catalyst for the French troops. And the men in the rear, who were being told now that it was their turn to go back up to the front and be sacrificed, said they had had enough. They were citizen soldiers of a republic. They were citizens first. They saw the wastage in the general's tactics and planning. They thought, we want to win this war, and we can't win this war the way that you're waging it. So they refused to, first gradually squads and platoons, and then sometimes entire regiments, refused to advance to the front lines.
The French did not benefit from the British attitude toward rotation. Home leave was regularly canceled, and when men were moved out of the front lines, they were not properly rested before they were sent back in. Rations were appalling, and the faith in the command had evaporated. Nivelle, the hero of Verdun, had failed his men.
But there were certain grievances that they felt needed to be addressed. One of the biggest one being the wastage in lives. But they even also had complaints about the food. They had notoriously poor food in the French army. So one of their grievances was, we want food that actually has vitamins in it and that is nutritious and changes somewhat. We also want to establish a better system of leave. They're in their home country, and some men hadn't been home for a year, sometimes longer. Leave was always suspended before bigger offensives as well. So a number of sort of social, political grievances that had to be addressed. And once those were addressed, they went on fighting, because by the autumn of 1917, they're already launching successful limited offensives against the German lines.
Once the 21st Division had made their stand, the insurrection spread like wildfire through the lines. Mutinous acts were recorded in 68 divisions, 136 regiments, and 23 battalions. Soldiers began to desert at a frightening rate, and many of those that stayed refused to go back up the lines. They demonstrated openly and sang revolutionary songs, including the Internationale. Despite the failures of Nivelle on the whole, the French did adhere to his famous utterance at Verdun, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass.
It wasn't walking away from the front and throwing their guns down. If the Germans had attacked, they would have fought back, surely.
Any more pointless attacks were out of the question, but the lines were still defended. The enmity felt towards the High Command was indeed strong, but it was nothing compared to that directed at the hated invaders. In the end, it was General Pétain who finally ended the insurrection and brought order to the lines. He took command and immediately improved living conditions, the allocation of leave, and further rotation of troops in and out of the line.
Pétain's approach was actually the right approach, I think, for the time. He had a reputation in the army of being a man who could identify with the troops, and the troops felt that he understood them, much more so than some of the other generals. His role at the Battle of Verdun sealed that role, where he had obviously demonstrated sort of a fatherly, compassionate role for his men. And they brought him in to deal with the mutinies because they thought, rather than bring in someone who's going to be harsh, a disciplinarian, punish everybody, and then have the entire army really get into revolt, they said, we need to negotiate with these people. And that way, the mutiny was very much like a labor strike. So they brought in a mediator, and the mediator was Pétain. Pétain immediately went about meeting some of these grievances and settling some of them, including reestablishing the system of leave, improving pay, building rest stations along the railroads for when troops were debarked so they didn't have to sleep in the train cars, all these small things.
He also instigated a policy of focusing attacks on achievable objectives and ensured that artillery, aircraft, and tanks properly supported the infantry's assaults.
And then on a more strategic level, he ended up saying to himself, okay, well listen, if the attack cannot succeed with a reasonable chance, and given the reasonable provisions and supplies and material and men, then we're not going to launch it. They're not going to launch an attack. So he brought in overwhelming firepower, planned everything down to the T, made sure the men had adequate knowledge of the ground they were going to be covering, made sure they were adequately supplied in weaponry, that the artillery was able to move forward in time to meet the advance of the troops. And by just making some of these more simple adjustments, he had 3 successful offensives, and I think that helped to restore the morale of the men, combined with the changes he made on their non-active side, I guess I should say.
The Germans never grasped what was occurring only a few meters from their positions. If they had, then the outcome of the war might have been very different. Quite why the Germans didn't pick up on the mutiny is difficult to assess, but partially it must be attributed to their attentions being focused on the Ypres salient and the British attack at Passchendaele. Even so, the discontent in the French ranks was no minor event. Between April 1917 and January 1918, as many as 40,000 men were involved in the uprising. As a result, 554 men were condemned to death by the French command. Many had been selected by drawing lots. Ultimately, only 26 were actually executed.
The men did not go unpunished. They actually sentenced a number to death. I don't quite recall the figure right now. It was several hundred. Most of them had their sentences suspended to life imprisonment or hard labor, and a number were also executed. And he felt that it was important in the most egregious of cases to make an example out of those who had taken this act. And I think the men who did it understood what was at stake as well. So there were sacrifices that had to be made for, I would say, a greater cause for their comrades.
The main French victory in the war, albeit a Pyrrhic one, had been at Verdun. As a result, Pétain was held in high regard by the poilus, and his efforts to control the line and improve conditions proved to be invaluable. Within a few months of the insurrection being brought under control, the Germans launched their Kaiserschlacht offensive, which tore through the Allied lines at a ferocious rate. But by then, a man whom many regarded to be one of France's greatest soldiers had reinvigorated his armies, enabling them to soak up the German onslaught. Mutiny in the ranks could have happened to any of the armies that occupied the ruined earth of the Western Front, but the fact that it was the French who rebelled is not a complete surprise. Nevertheless, it was certainly not cowardice that shattered their attacking will. The French losses during the war were truly horrendous, with their dead, wounded, and missing totaling almost 6 million men, about double the figure for the British and more than that of the Germans. But more importantly, the mutiny was the result of men being pushed beyond the limit of what they could endure. Their collective courage had been slowly eroded away by the attritional nature of a war from which there could only be one winner. The conflict may have been a war between nations, but in reality, it was also a titanic battle between man and his industrially manufactured killing weapons. And in a global conflict between flesh and material, it was always going to be man who cracked first. The machine gun, which so came to dominate and even to personify the battlefields of World War I, was a fairly primitive device when General War began in August 1914. At the time, machine guns of all armies were largely of the heavy variety and decidedly ill-suited to portability for use by rapidly advancing infantry troops. Each weighed somewhere in the 80 to 100-pound range, often without their mountings, carriages, and supplies. The 1914 machine gun, usually positioned on a flat tripod, would require a gun crew of 4 to 6 operators. In theory, they could fire 400 to 600 small-caliber rounds per minute, a figure that was to more than double by the war's end, with rounds fed via a fabric belt or a metal strip. The reality, however, was that these early machine guns would rapidly overheat and become inoperative without the aid of cooling mechanisms. They were consequently fired in short rather than sustained bursts. Cooling generally took one of two forms: water-cooled and, increasingly as the war developed, air-cooled. Water jackets provided for the former, and air vents were built into the machine guns for the latter. Water-cooled machine guns still overheated relatively quickly, sometimes within 2 minutes, with the consequence that large supplies of water were needed during the heat of the battle, and it was not unusual for a machine gun crew to solve the problem by urinating into the jacket.
The water jacket is used for water cooling the barrels, because at the higher rate of fire, the barrels will overheat and will start distorting. You fill the water in this port here, and then these little glands that keeps the water from spilling out, but it still does. This is a recoil system. The barrel actually recoils back to break the lock, because the lock is kind of like a knee action. The Luger pistol uses the same knee action, so when the gun is in position, it's locked and ready to fire. When the barrel comes back, it kicks the knee out and then pushes the bolt back through the gas pressure of the barrel, or the cartridge case. And then it cycles through the whole system. This is a belt-fed weapon. Normally they use a cloth belt, and it would pick the rounds up and just slowly feed it through and then eject out the front. This is the cocking handle. To engage it, you would go back like this, and you have to do it twice. The first one is to pick the round up and get it in the chamber, and the second one is to pick up the last one. This is your fire. This is the trigger system right here. This is the safety. You push forward, and that fires the weapon.
Whether air or water cooled, machine guns still jammed frequently, especially in hot conditions, or when used by inexperienced operators. Consequently, machine guns would often be grouped together to maintain a constant defensive position. Estimates of their equivalent accurate rifle firepower varied, with some estimating a single machine gun to be worth as many as 60 to 100 rifles. A more consensual figure is around 80, still an impressively high figure. At the start of the war in August 1914, the German army had 12,000 Maxim machine guns at their disposal, a number which eventually ballooned to 100,000. In contrast, the British and French had access to a mere few hundred equivalents when the war began.
Hiram Maxim was an American designer, engineer, and lived out in the East Coast, exactly I think it was New York, developed the Maxim machine gun. At that time, the Americans weren't interested in it. They had the Gatling gun, and cartridge rounds were still kind of in their infancy. And then he ended up going to England and working with Maxim Nordfelt, I believe it is, and developed the machine gun, sold it to all the armies in the world, and he believed that this would be the weapon that would end all war because it was such a devastating weapon that everybody would be aghast by how many people it could kill. He would always do his sales trips by setting up a Maxim, and at this time they were using black powder. Smokeless hadn't really been developed yet, and he would demonstrate cutting trees down with his machine gun. So governments around the world ended up buying the design, and the Germans ended up with this design. And basically this is almost the same as the Vickers, which is a British version of this weapon.
As already noted, the Germans quickly grasped the potential importance of machine guns on the battlefield. From the outset, the German army demonstrated the value of the machine gun by creating separate machine gun companies to support infantry battalions.
In the beginning, the German army used these in machine gun companies. They were a special company, and they would be assigned to a battalion. Later on in the war, the weapon changed. It went to a lighter weapon, which is a model 1915. But they would still have these as the heavy weapons. Now this weapon is in a trench mount, and it's not the heavy sled mount that usually carries. The heavy sled mount is this big contraption that they would plop up against. It would take two guys to carry the weapon. So in the deployment, they would do mostly enfilade fire, where they would cross the weapons in this way, and then they would have another set of weapons going this way, not really directly shooting at the front.
The British, however, did not create their machine gun corps until October 1915. Until this time, the few machine guns available were attached in sections to individual battalions. A mere 2 guns were allocated to each infantry battalion in 1914. When established in fixed strongpoints sited specifically to cover potential enemy attack routes, the machine gun proved a fearsome defensive weapon. Enemy infantry assaults upon such positions invariably proved highly costly.
World War I introduced the light machine gun. The war began, all the machine guns were very heavy, 100, 150 pounds, very hard to move, and basically stayed in the trenches. But in order to be able to go across no man's land and take firepower with advancing infantry, lighter weapons had to be developed.
To meet that need, the British developed the Lewis gun.
The British adopted another weapon, the Lewis gun. Designed by retired American Colonel Isaac Newton Lewis just before the war, it was adopted by the British Army. Instead of having 4 automatic rifles per rifle platoon of 40 or 50 men, they instead used just the one Lewis gun because of its firepower. The weapon is heavier than the other automatic rifles. It fires the same infantry cartridge, but instead of a 20-round magazine, it has a 47-round magazine on top. It fires at about the same speed, but instead of just being air-cooled like a bare barrel, it has a radiator on it. This big metal pan that you see on the outside here does not have water in it. It has 17 aluminum fins on the inside. It works like a radiator. As the gun fires, heat here from this end draws by vacuum the hot air across the hot chamber and barrel from the rear out to the front. What that does is it cools the barrel, kind of like a Volkswagen engine, air-cooled radiator. What this does, it allows you to fire the weapon up to 600 to 800 rounds and sustain fire before it gets too hot to fire. You could never do that with any other automatic rifle of World War I.
The French in particular found to their cost that the technology of defensive warfare was more advanced than that of offensive warfare. The French pre-war military blueprint, Plan 17, was founded upon a fundamental assumption of an offensive spirit, one which envisioned a rapid war of movement.
The weapon that you see here in front is known as a CSRG 1915, or Shosho, after its designer. See, in World War I, machine guns were very heavy when they began the war. They weighed upwards of 150 pounds and were very difficult for the troops to move forward, so they stayed in fixed positions, particularly in the trenches. But the French had an attitude. They had the Germans camped out on 30% of their front yard, so they had to come up with an offensive movement of taking firepower forward across no man's land with them. One of the things they adapted was the Shosho. This is the first assault rifle. It weighs 20 pounds. It has a 20-round magazine which fires full-size infantry cartridges, 8mm Lebel. It is selective fire, which means it fires full automatic or semi-automatic. It is not a machine gun. It is an automatic rifle. What that means is you can only fire it for short periods of time, then you have to let it cool. There's no way to put a fresh, cool barrel on it, and there's no water jacket that works like a distillery to cool it down, like a radiator. But that's okay. It's light, it's mobile, and it's cheap.
The British similarly found to their repeated cost the futility of massed infantry attacks against well-entrenched defensive positions protected by machine gun cover. The first day of the Somme offensive amply illustrated this, although the lesson appeared to be lost to the British High Command. On the opening day of the offensive, the British suffered a record number of single-day casualties, 60,000, the great majority lost under punishing machine gun fire. Understandably, most historical accounts of the First World War have tended to emphasize the defensive strengths of the machine gun. Throughout the war, efforts were made to produce an infantry assault version, such as the Lewis light machine gun, although these efforts were generally unsatisfactory. A more successful assault weapon was the Browning automatic rifle.
This is an original one made in 1918 at Winchester, and it says Browning machine rifle on top. But by the time the doughboys got to France, the Army changed the name. They began calling it the Browning automatic rifle, or BAR. The BAR was issued in 1918, only saw service the last 7 weeks of combat in the war. But those were 7 very intense weeks with a lot of movement and a lot of fire. The weapon only weighs 15.5 pounds. The Shosho is 20 and the Lewis is 30 pounds. It fires the full-size rifle cartridge of the Americans, the 30-06, the same as the 1903 rifle and the later World War II rifle, the Garand. It fires from a 20-round magazine from an open bolt. It's very light. There is no bipod to it. It has a wooden buttstock to it. Come on, gents. It has a wooden buttstock on it. Fairly light, and it's meant to be fired either from the shoulder, from the hip, or from the ground and prone supported. In World War II, they put a bipod on the end and changed the buttstock. For the Korean War, they put a handle on top for holding onto while it was being fired. The weapon was used by the U.S. military, the Army and the Marine Corps from 1918 until 1962. It was not withdrawn until it was replaced on the cusp of Vietnam by the M60 machine gun. The BAR came late, but it was the finest light automatic of World War I.
Although lighter at around 24 pounds, they were still considered too heavy and bulky for rapidly advancing infantry. Attempts to transport light machine guns by wheeled carriages or pack animals were ultimately unsuccessful. The infantry invariably outpaced such methods.
Up to your waist in water, up to your eyes in sludge, using the kind of language that makes the sergeant blush. Oh, wouldn't join the army, that's what we all inquire. Don't we pity the poor civilians sitting around the fire? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. It's a lovely war. Wouldn't be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the sergeant brings a breakfast up to bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, what do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Oh, for the right turn, how do we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, what will be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the sergeant brings our breakfast up to bed. What? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Far to retard, we spend the money we earn. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.